Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a concept that is, well, not just dense, but profoundly unsettling.
It really is.
We're exploring a kind of tragedy that doesn't begin with loud explosions or, public conflict. It begins with convenience, with silence, and a gentle, almost irresistible suggestion.
Exactly. The central idea in the critical philosophical sources we've gathered today, and it's a whole stack of them, is that the greatest danger doesn't come from coercion.
Right.
It comes from optimization. The suggestion is simple. This is the optimal way to think. And the modern tragedy is that we are, for the most part, willingly accepting that path.
Okay, let's unpack this because that's a huge idea. We're looking at a deep philosophical critique, and our sources today are filtering this through a very specific, very intense lens.
Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Why Dostoevsky? What does the 19th century Russian novelist have to say about AI in modern education?
Well, he has everything to say about it. Dostoevsky was the great chronicler of human freedom, of the sheer crushing burden of choice, and the messy, often self-contradictory nature of our internal will.
Okay.
So our mission today is to really understand how this relentless systemic push for efficiency, especially in education, and now supercharged by AI, might be unintentionally eroding that core human capacity, the capacity for genuine, messy, independent thought.
The very thing Dostoevsky warned us not to give away.
The very thing.
So it seems like we have a really clear core conflict for this deep dive. On one side, we've got optimized thinking.
Right.
This is the fast, consistent, highly measurable way of thinking. It's designed to minimize friction, to remove error. It delivers the results the system values: high scores, coherent essays, professional-looking outputs.
And on the other side of that, you have human thinking. And this is thought that is often, contradictory, it's slow, it's wildly prone to error. It wanders all over the place in search of clarity, and it's absolutely necessary for the kind of intellectual and moral growth that actually builds character.
So the tragedy, as the source materials frame it, is that when we're given the choice between the pain of genuine thought and the comfort of optimization,
we're increasingly choosing the latter. We're trading our intellectual sovereignty for comfort, for convenience.
Let's jump straight into that. The sources call this a quiet tragedy, and I think that phrasing is perfect.
It is.
There is no tyrant, there's no coercion, it's just, as you said, a reasonable offer that people accept because, and I love this quote from the source, they are tired of having to think too much.
And who can't relate to that? I mean, that fatigue is the fertile ground where this whole tragedy takes root.
Absolutely. We're all mentally exhausted.
We live in a world where our mental bandwidth is constantly taxed by, complex choices, endless notifications, economic anxieties. AI arrives not as the threat, but as the perfect analgesic for that mental overload.
It's a painkiller.
It is. And the tragedy is silent because the author seems entirely rational. Why struggle and risk error when you can be efficient and guaranteed to be correct?
And this plays out, I imagine, most dramatically in the educational environment.
That's the primary laboratory for this experiment.
Because the very measurement of success there has shifted. The sources highlight this change in the fundamental classroom question. It used to be, what do you think and how did you get there?
Right, show me your work. But the work was the thinking process. Now, in so many contexts, the question pivots. It becomes, did you follow the suggested optimized steps correctly?
The focus shifts completely. It goes from internal struggle and personal conviction to just external adherence.
To systematic conformity. And what's so insidious is that at first no one complains. Why would they? The short-term results are spectacular.
Let's really detail that game for a second because it's undeniable. Results get better immediately.
Instantly.
Scores are higher across the board. Assignments that used to take days now take a couple of hours. AI provides these instant articulate answers. The arguments are coherent. There are no spelling mistakes, no structural errors.
For a system that overwhelmingly measures human value by performance, by output, by speed.
Which is our system?
It is. The system sees AI not just as a tool, but as the ultimate frictionless performance enhancer. It's a dream come true.
But this is where we have to dig into the true philosophical cost. What the source describes is the slow erosion of motive. The engine inside is being worn down.
That's the phrase, Dunko Beatbaum. The tragedy isn't the A+ on the paper. It's the internal price you paid to get it.
So what does that erosion of motive lead to in the long run? What does that person look like 10, 20 years down the line?
It leads to the creation of a person who is exceptionally functional on the outside, but well, fundamentally hollowed out in their inner life.
How so?
When a student habitually chooses the optimized path, they are learning a very profound lesson, whether they realize it or not,
Which is?
that the process of thinking is secondary to the predictable outcome. They don't become ignorant, that's a misconception. They're full of information.
They become obedient.
They become profoundly obedient. The source uses the Vietnamese term ngoan, which has this weight to it. It's not just simple obedience, it suggests a sort of compliant, highly rewarded, even praised submissiveness.
And that very obedience gets relabeled. We call it optimization.
We do, but the sources argue it's actually a philosophical retreat of the will, a surrender.
I have to push back a little here, though, just to play devil's advocate.
Please.
If optimization helps, say, historically marginalized students who might struggle with traditional, slow-paced essay writing, if it gives them access and higher success rates, isn't that a net positive?
That is a critical question.
Isn't efficiency a social good in that context?
It's a critical question because it speaks to the reasonableness that makes this whole dynamic so seductive and so tricky. Optimization absolutely delivers better results by the system's current metrics.
Okay.
But we have to ask the deeper question. Are those metrics measuring genuine intellectual development, or are they just measuring predictable output?
And Dostoevsky's work gives us the answer.
It gives us a chilling answer, which is that humans often fear the responsibility of choice more than they fear actual suffering. When AI offers optimization, it's offering to absolve you of that heavy, fearful responsibility.
So it isn't forcing you to stop thinking. That's the key.
No, not at all.
It's giving you the perfect, rational justification not to engage in that painful internal labor that's required for original thought. The choice to delegate your thinking is framed as the smart, practical decision.
Precisely. Why would you wrestle with a difficult problem, risk failure, and endure hours of doubt and confusion when a perfect structure already exists? A structure that guarantees a high-performance result.
Right.
Human thought, the source reminds us, it wasn't born to optimize. It was born to resist, to wander, to contradict itself, and ultimately to commit itself imperfectly to a personal perspective. When the cost of that commitment is a lower grade, few are willing to pay it.
Let's get into those illustrative examples from the source because they really show the mechanism of this abdication. Let's start with the high school student, the one preparing for the standardized analysis essay.
The source sketches this out perfectly. The student faces a prompt, let's say, analyzing a complicated theme in Shakespeare.
A classic.
A classic. But instead of opening the book and enduring the initial confusion of the text, they open an AI and they ask for the fastest, most coherent analysis for a guaranteed high score.
And what do they get?
They get a perfect outline, a clear thesis, 3 well-defined supporting points, perfect evidence integration. They replicate it, they submit it, and they get an A. The system judges this as a success, and the student feels smart.
But the essential question, the deep ethical question the sources insist we ask is, what did the student not experience in that process?
They bypassed the confusion. They never felt that internal doubt about the theme. They never mentally resisted the prompt and thought, actually, wait a minute, I think the author's real point contradicts this popular interpretation.
So their experience was one of polite replication.
That's the perfect term for it, not genuine intellectual conflict. They learned the method of analysis, but they didn't develop the will to analyze.
And the second example from the source takes this out of the classroom and into life decisions where the stakes are, well, they're existential.
This is the college student facing that agonizing choice of a major or a career path.
We've all been there.
Absolutely. And instead of consulting their own deep, unformed passions or interests, they consult an AI model. The AI processes the data, market trends, salary projections, stability indices.
And it presents the options.
It presents the options. Stable industry A, high income but potentially soul-crushing industry B, or the risky passion-driven industry C. And the student follows the data-driven, reasonable choice, not out of passion, but out of a deep-seated fear of making the wrong, inefficient choice that might lead to economic insecurity.
In that moment, something huge is lost. The source calls it the right to be wrong. That sounds simple, but it feels much heavier than that.
It's the right to own your mistakes. The source uses the phrase, tu chi traknim cho kaisai kulmin.
To be responsible for your own errors.
Yes. Growth, intellectual maturity, character itself, it's forged when you take responsibility for a decision, even a wrong one, that came from your own genuine self-directed thought.
And AI offers the opposite of that.
It offers mental security, The Vietnamese is Sien Toan Ting Tuns. It whispers, follow this process and you won't stray, you won't face judgment. But the price for that security is the capacity to think as a free, fallible human being who is capable of owning their own trajectory.
So this is a kind of intellectual hedging. You're taking out an insurance policy on your thoughts.
100%.
If the path turns out to be wrong, if Industry A collapses in 10 years, you can blame the model, the data, the circumstance. You don't have to blame your own intuition or courage. You've shielded your ego.
Exactly. And this brings us to a crucial nuance that the source material is very careful to establish. The core problem here is not the technology itself.
It's just a tool.
It's just a tool processing patterns. It has no intention. The problem is how we as humans deploy AI within a system that is already built on a deep-seated institutional fear of error and inefficiency.
A system that's terrified of mistakes.
Terrified of them. So if a machine can remove the noise of human error, the system, which is driven by performance metrics, will inevitably choose the machine's clean path over the human's messy struggle, every single time.
The ultimate outcome, when you frame it through that Dostoevskian lens, is profound. When AI proposes the optimal way to think, the deepest risk is not that students will be wrong,
but that they will no longer have any reason to even ask themselves if the thought they produced is truly theirs. They forfeit their intellectual self-authorship.
Okay, so we've established that the AI is really just a responder. It's responding to a pre-existing human need. So if we start blaming the technology, we have to look inward. Where does this profound desire to delegate our toughest intellectual work, our own thinking, actually come from?
The sources argue this desire is ancient. It's not new at all. Before AI, we sought out rigid ideologies or charismatic leaders or dogmatic systems to tell us what to think.
Right.
AI just provided the fastest, most rational-sounding means to fulfill that persistent human need. The need to escape the burden of freedom.
You're drawing a very sharp line there between just thinking and bearing the responsibility that comes with it.
That is the crucial distinction.
Yeah.
Humans don't inherently hate thinking. We're curious creatures. We hate the accountability that genuine free thought imposes on us.
Because genuine thought is messy.
It's messy. It contradicts itself, it wanders, it's prone to huge mistakes, and it forces the thinker to bear the consequences of those mistakes. When you commit to a messy thought, you're standing alone.
And following the optimal path, then, becomes the ultimate escape route from that loneliness.
It's a genius protection mechanism for the ego. It truly is. If I follow a vetted, optimized process, whether it's an AI structure or a standardized curriculum, and the result is good, I get the reward.
And if it's bad?
If the result is bad, the error belongs to the method, or the data, or the circumstance. My ego, my sense of intellectual confidence, is shielded. The fear of being judged as wrong or slow is reduced to almost zero.
And you mentioned that this fear of judgment isn't just personal, it's structurally reinforced within our institutions.
Absolutely. The system is designed to punish error far more visibly and immediately than it rewards deep, unique intellectual struggle.
I see that. A wrong answer on a test isn't just a stepping stone to learning, it's often seen as an immediate mark of incompetence, a failure.
Exactly. The student who risks a unique interpretation of a poem and falls a bit short often sees their grade drop sharply. Meanwhile, the student who follows the safe standard interpretation gets a solid B or A.
So the silent, repeated lesson that gets hammered home is that Ingehak LaRousse row thinking differently is a significant risk.
It's a costly choice, and the mind adapts very quickly. If risk brings punishment and conformity brings reward, the mind will self-optimize for conformity.
Which brings us right back to Dostoevsky.
It does. He knew that freedom is heavy. It requires choice, which requires responsibility, which requires a kind of existential courage. Compliance, on the other hand, only requires obedience, and AI makes that obedience appear profoundly mathematically smart.
Can we elaborate on that philosophical link for a minute? You mentioned Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor in the sources. For any listener who might not be familiar with that text, what is the core idea there, and how does it connect so directly to AI?
It's probably one of the most famous parables in all of philosophical literature from his novel, The Brothers Karamazov. The Grand Inquisitor is this old cardinal who captures Christ, who has returned to Earth.
Okay.
And the Inquisitor tells Christ that he made a terrible mistake by giving humanity freedom. The freedom to choose between good and evil, truth and falsehood. He says this freedom is too heavy a burden for most people. It just leads to suffering, confusion, and fear.
So what's the Inquisitor's solution?
To take away that painful freedom, to replace it with universal security, with sustenance, with bread, and with absolute rigid order. The people, he argues, will happily trade their freedom, that terrible burden of choice, for comfortable security and guaranteed food.
And in our context, AI is the new Grand Inquisitor.
It serves as the perfect technocratic inquisitor. It offers the promise of high scores and efficiency, our modern bread and order, in exchange for the messy, agonizing freedom of intellectual struggle.
So no one ever tells the student, you must stop thinking for yourself.
Never.
They are told, think this way because it is more effective, more measurable, and it guarantees better sustenance, which in this case is a better grade, a better future.
That is the brilliant deception. It feeds into this profound misconception that if a way of thinking yields good results, efficiency, high scores, it must be the correct way of thinking.
But the sources argue that's a false equivalence.
A deeply false one. Human thought, they contend, was born to create meaning en Gaia in Vietnamese. It was born to grapple with existence, not just to create optimized, measurable results. And those two goals are often mutually exclusive.
So an AI-generated essay can be logically perfect, the argument can be flawless, but if the student never really struggled with the core idea,
then the work is merely a product. It's a commodity. It lacks the meaning that is derived from a personal intellectual experience.
the vital question then is always, did the writer ever struggle with an idea they didn't yet fully grasp?
Exactly. True intellectual growth requires learning how to tolerate ambiguity, to sit in that foggy, uncertain middle ground where you don't know the answer, but you refuse to let go of the question.
And AI instantly erases that necessary ambiguity. It just swoops in and imposes structure and neatness. It provides the framework before the human has to endure the internal confusion that actually forces maturation.
Can a person who's never experienced that internal chaos truly be said to be thinking in the Dostoevskian sense? I mean, or are they just efficiently operating a machine?
The most revealing part of the source material on this point was what they called the real human scratch observation.
Yes, where the author turns the mirror back on themselves.
It's that moment of vulnerability, right? Where the author admits to choosing to use AI to avoid that uncomfortable feeling of uncertainty, that come jack bup, Ben.
Yeah, we all know that feeling, every single one of us. It's that moment you're staring at the blank page and you feel stupid, you feel slow, you feel intellectually backward compared to the speed of the machine.
And AI is a form of mental numbing against that specific discomfort.
It is. It's so powerful to acknowledge that. It's not that we lose the ability to think. We just learn that the process of thinking is painful and crucially optional.
Something that can be outsourced to a better service provider.
Yes. And once thinking becomes just another service, it ceases to be viewed as an essential internal part of the self.
So the psychological root is fear. We didn't give AI this power because it was superior. We gave it the power because it was a tool to help us evade the fear and pain inherent in taking responsibility for our own messy, contradictory, and potentially failing thought processes.
That's the heart of it.
That sets the stage perfectly for the system. I mean, the individual student's surrender is painful to watch, but the system is what formalizes it, what rewards it. So how does the educational architecture perpetuate this abdication of thought?
We have to remember the scale of it all. The sources stress that modern education is, first and foremost, a management system.
That's a cold way to put it.
It is, but it's accurate. It doesn't ask the philosophical question, who is this person becoming? It asks the technocratic question, has this person met the standard? And when you're managing tens of millions of students, the system demands consistency, comparison, measurement, and repeatability.
And consistency is the absolute enemy of idiosyncratic, unique, messy human thought.
So this is where AI steps in as the perfect managerial tool. It's the perfect cog, because it never doubts. It never gets tired. It never resists. It doesn't ask, is this method ethical or meaningful? It simply delivers predictable output.
So for the system managers, the administrators dealing with mass education, where metrics govern everything from funding to reputation.
For them, AI is the realization of perfect administrative control. It's a dream.
So the key insight here is that the system isn't designed to protect unique thought. It's designed to manage the masses efficiently and reliably.
And in a system like that, individual error is not viewed as an essential intellectual step. It's seen as noise. The source uses the word you.
Noise.
The noise that slows progress. Noise disrupts the neat comparison of students against the standard. Noise complicates the data. Therefore, individual, messy thought immediately becomes a risk, an instability that management have to try and eliminate.
I see the connection so clearly now. AI doesn't just help the student optimize their output, it helps the administrator optimize the input for grading. An AI-optimized paper is infinitely easier to grade, to categorize, to report on than a brilliant but structurally unconventional paper that was born of some deep human struggle.
And this leads to that quiet structural swap we talked about. Thinking is replaced by a thinking process. A Kitrin Suya.
Because you can control the process.
You can control the process, you can standardize the steps, and you can measure a person's adherence to that process. Genuine free thought, however, is fundamentally uncontrollable. This is Dostoevsky's vision coming to life. The system seeks to treat humans like variables in a formula, and AI is the ultimate calculator.
Let's focus on the manipulation here, the price of deviation. The system rarely uses outright bans or coercion, especially not in higher education.
It doesn't need to. The student who asks, "Can I approach this essay differently outside this suggested format?" is usually told something like,
Yes, but.
"Yes, but be aware that the standardized rubric rewards the suggested structure, and you risk losing points. It's consequence, not coercion."
And when you're placed between intellectual freedom and a material punishment, a lower grade, most rational people will choose safety.
Of course they will. AI simply makes that safe choice look demonstrably smarter than the risky independent one.
So the system is just structurally ill-equipped to value the struggle. It can only value the result.
It can't tolerate the complexity of human internal struggle. It chooses right and efficient every single time because those are the only variables it can measure quickly and reliably.
And this creates a terrifying uniformity.
It does, not of dress, like in the old days, but of intellectual production. Papers start sounding the same, arguments stick to the safest interpretations, and genuine, distinct expression just vanishes because the system rewards similarity and efficiency.
And the ultimate form of manipulation, as Dostoevsky outlined, is giving people a rational, self-interested reason to control their own behavior.
That's the entire mechanism.
Oh.
AI doesn't forbid different thinking. It just makes different thinking economically and academically disadvantageous. If an entire generation learns that independent, non-optimized thought, while theoretically allowed, comes with the cost of lower grades, longer time investment, and more criticism, they will rationally choose not to engage in it.
The risk isn't replacement by AI, it's self-decommissioning.
It is. The system, already so fearful of error, finally finds a tool to get humans to willingly give up their right to think differently.
Let's examine the long-term internal damage. What happens inside the mind of a young person whose entire intellectual journey has been one of continuous structural reinforcement and safety nets?
The source material uses a really powerful phrase to describe this state. It's not ignorance, but a thinned inner self. The Vietnamese is no tam bi la mong.
A thinned inner self, what does that mean exactly?
The student is functionally intelligent. They're very capable of navigating complex tasks, but their thinking slides exclusively across the surface of established structures.
It's like navigating a pitch-black room only by holding onto the walls.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Never daring to step into the confusing, ambiguous middle of the room.
And on the outside, the outputs, the coherence, the speed, the perfect arguments, they look pristine. But internally, the will to think, the ichi tu doi, is silently receding, or it's being rerouted.
And that will to think, for Dostoevsky, was fundamental to being human. He valued the person who would endure pain just to prove they were not a predictable cog in a machine, not a piano key being played by a formula.
Yet, in this optimized environment where every path is suggested,
The student volunteers for the piano bench. They accept the formula because it is rational, it is comfortable, and it guarantees success.
the most concrete symptom of this thinning, according to the sources, is that paralyzing fear of the blank page when the structure is finally removed.
It is absolute paralysis. You ask students to write an essay without a provided prompt, without a thesis structure or an outline, and they are frozen.
And it's not because they can't write.
Not at all. It's because they haven't practiced starting from that state of necessary ambiguity. That feeling of su hong mang ne. Genuine, profound thought begins with that ambiguity. An unclear feeling, an unformed question, a shaky hypothesis.
But AI eliminates that ambiguity far too early in the process. It provides a framework, a suggested structure, before the student has endured the internal labor that's required to form their own rough idea.
They completely bypass the most formative stage. And once they become accustomed to the best way to think, they begin to police their own initial messy thoughts.
How so?
They'll have an idea and immediately think, my own idea is probably not good enough. I should follow the AI suggestion for safety and coherence. This act of self-negation, which sounds like humility, becomes a pattern of internal self-rejection over time. They start to preemptively filter their own ideas based on whether they are optimizable.
And this brings us to what the sources call the dangerous philosophical flip that defines the trajectory of this generation.
The central intellectual question changes entirely. It flips from the essential self-defining question, what do I think about this complex issue?
To what?
To the external safety-seeking question, how should one think to avoid error? The Vietnamese is Nen Kai No the Kom Sai.
And the consequences of that flip are just. They're far-reaching. They become excellent at answering standardized prompts.
But increasingly weak at formulating original questions.
They're magnificent task completers, but they become hesitant when asked to choose an uncertain direction.
Highly adept at optimizing, but terrified of the responsibility for choices that lack a guarantee of success. And AI provides the perfect mental comfort by eliminating that internal discomfort of uncertainty.
But the sources are very clear on this point. This comfort is dangerous. It is not healing, it's numbing. The phrase used is no lomte.
It is intellectual Novocaine. The student, who is so obedient and efficient in the classroom, eventually steps out into real life. And in real life, there is no rubric for a career change, no sample answer for a moral dilemma, and no optimal path for forming a family.
And in that moment of profound, unstructured choice, all those years of rewarded obedience become a catastrophic liability.
They will wait for an external direction that will never come because they were never trained to live with the uncertainty of their own independent thought. They haven't been allowed to practice standing alone before their own confusion.
That fear of being slow or stupid during that initial moment of struggle is precisely the fear that AI helps them evade.
It is, but it is by enduring that fear, by struggling through that ambiguity, that an individual develops resilience and genuinely held, non-optimized convictions. We cannot automate courage.
We have to move upward in the system now and examine the drivers. Children adapt to the environment, they don't create it.
That's right.
So why do the adults, the teachers, the parents, the administrators have such a profound desire for young people to adopt this optimized way of thinking?
Well, the sources identify the core drivers as entirely human, entirely predictable fears. Teachers fear falling behind the technological curve, or appearing irrelevant, or just being unable to handle the administrative load of non-standardized work.
And parents?
Parents fear their children being inferior. They fear them missing the one path to economic success or failing to achieve the bread, that high-status, high-score outcome.
And administrators fear system inefficiency and that noise we discussed earlier.
Exactly, and AI steps into this ecosystem of fear with a gentle technocratic promise. We can control the outcome. We can reduce the risk.
That is an extremely powerful promise.
It is, because the cost of true, messy, free thinking is something adults are increasingly unwilling to bear in a highly competitive, metrics-driven society. Free thinking means errors, it means delays, it means shared responsibility and non-standardized results. No one wants to be the one responsible for this slow, messy, inefficient thought process.
This is where that Grand Inquisitor parallel becomes devastatingly clear again. It's the modern trade. Trading intellectual freedom for guaranteed high scores and a structured, safe educational environment.
The bread is the high score, the guaranteed college acceptance letter, the smooth career progression. The order is the standardized curriculum and the perfectly optimized output.
And free thought becomes a perceived luxury.
It becomes a threat to the high score and the standardized outcome. So the adults rationally choose the safer, optimized path, and they label it progress or preparing them for the future.
But this creates a painful, inescapable paradox. The adults lecture their children on the necessity of creativity and independent thought,
while their actions and the system's rewards fundamentally privilege safety and conformity. They measure and they fund based on the correct, predictable answer.
And children are supremely sensitive to this hypocrisy.
They learn immediately that the stated goal creativity is irrelevant compared to the required action. which is achieving a predictable, manageable result that reassures the anxious adults around them.
So the system is actually rewarding students not for deep thought, but for the successful psychological management of their parents' and teachers' anxieties.
That's a brilliant way to put it. If the student's work is perfectly coherent, fast, and high-scoring, the adult can relax. Dostoevsky would look at this and ask the chilling question: do you truly want free human beings who will necessarily struggle and risk failure? Or do you merely want human beings who do not make you worry?
And the adults, implicitly, choose reassurance. They prioritize the reduction of their own fear of complexity over the maturation of their child's intellectual will.
The source material's conclusion here is tough, but it's clear. AI in education is potent not because it is technologically superior, but because it helps adults reduce their fear of the complex, unformed human being. The system chooses safety over maturity, and the price of this adult reassurance is the student's freedom of thought.
We're transferring our own fear of failure onto the next generation, and we're using optimization as the vehicle.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, we've painted a pretty stark picture of structural and psychological danger, but we can't ban AI. It is here to stay. It has real utility. The practical question now is, how do we fundamentally redefine its role in the learning process so that we retain intellectual freedom and that necessary struggle?
The solution can't be prohibition. It has to be redefining AI's fundamental position in the workflow.
So we have to shift it.
We have to shift it from being the proposer of the optimal way to being merely a mirror reflecting one potential way of thinking. The Vietnamese is "Don't go van cho ka chim."
That distinction is crucial. When it proposes the optimal way, it kills the internal process. But when it's just a mirror reflecting a possibility,
It leaves intellectual space for self-assertion, for resistance, for disagreement.
okay, so if we reserve that Dostoevskian right to disagree, our first hard solution must be structural.
It has to be. We must force students to critique the AI output as a core academic obligation, integral to the assignment itself.
So the assignment is no longer judged by how closely it mirrors the AI's standard structure, but by how well it demonstrates intellectual resistance.
Exactly. The central question of the assignment shifts from, did you follow the suggested structure, to what logical, emotional, or philosophical weakness did you find in the AI's suggested response? And how did you use that critique to build your own different path?
A good assignment under this new model would only get a high score if it successfully demonstrates where the AI is insufficient.
Yes. This forces students to engage in metacognition. They have to analyze not just the subject, but the analysis itself. Now, this slows the grading down, it makes administration more complex, and it definitely increases the teacher's cognitive load.
But it reclaims the student's agency.
It reclaims their agency and their intellectual self-defense.
Okay, hard solution number 2 from the sources. We must deliberately reintroduce tasks that AI struggles to optimize. We have to force the student to stand alone with their thoughts.
These have to be questions that require personal confrontation, or subjective evaluation, or the integration of deeply contradictory experiences.
Give me an example.
Instead of asking, analyze character X using established literary theory, we ask, what specific flaw in character X reminds you of a time you failed someone you loved? And how does that personal recognition change your philosophical critique of the text?
Wow. That forces a confrontation with personal, non-standardized emotional reasoning. It requires self-knowledge, not just pattern recognition.
Or, instead of asking for a simple summary of 2 historical arguments, you ask, take argument A, which you believe is morally correct, and synthesize it with argument B, which you know to be factually more accurate. Now, write a conclusion that acknowledges the inherent contradiction without resolving it neatly.
You're forcing them to process ambiguity, to sit with it.
Exactly.
Hard solution number 3. We must structurally re-legitimize error. It has to be seen as an essential part of the thinking process, not just a mistake to be fixed immediately.
In an optimized environment, error feels obsolete, a bug to be patched. But a mind that has never been wrong is a mind that has never been truly tested.
So how do you do that in practice?
You implement practical grading changes. For example, a teacher could issue a grade for the initial thought draft, explicitly rewarding risk-taking, complexity, and unique structuring, even if the execution is messy. Then a separate, maybe higher stakes grade is given for the final optimized polish.
So the first grade must reward what the source calls responsible disorder.
The rubric has to include space for ruli what kashkotraknev, that responsible disorder. the willingness to explore a complex idea that might not lead to a perfect conclusion. We must reward the courage to be wrong.
And finally, hard solution number 4. Educators and parents have to set absolute boundaries on AI's functional role.
Right. Not limits on screen time, which is superficial, but limits on the point of intervention.
Explain that.
AI can be a useful assistant for checking logic, suggesting structural improvements, or flagging weak points in the middle or at the end of the creative process. But it must never be deployed during that initial moment of ambiguity, that blank page moment.
So if a student opens AI before they have generated a core, messy, self-authored thought of their own,
A hypothesis, a feeling, a vague idea, then the system has already failed. They have lost the most important opportunity for growth.
these solutions, they all sound inherently inefficient. They introduce friction, they increase administrative time, they fundamentally slow the whole machine down.
They absolutely do. And the source material is brutally honest about this. These measures make education less efficient and much harder to manage and grade. But if smooth efficiency is upheld as the highest institutional goal, then we only need algorithms and systems. We don't really need humans. The system has to choose to retain that necessary space for responsible disorder if it wishes to produce thinking human beings, rather than just more efficient cogs.
The ultimate point is clear. AI won't kill human thought, but we will make human thought redundant if we use AI specifically to eliminate the productive, necessary ambiguity that the thinking process requires.
Let's bring this whole discussion back to the listener's life, outside the classroom. The critical test for this optimized generation comes when they face a decision with no rubric, no optimal answer, and only unquantifiable consequences.
A moment where no AI can bear the responsibility for them.
That is the moment of truth. If we continue to prioritize efficiency above all else, we will train people who can react quickly and coherently to prompts, but we will not prepare them to stand alone before choice. The source uses the phrase, "den Mintrykluyachan."
We will have created a generation fundamentally unprepared for the weight of genuine freedom.
Dostoevsky valued the freedom to bear responsibility, even if that freedom led to suffering and pain. He knew that the refusal to suffer is the refusal to grow.
A person accustomed to the optimal way will experience genuine debilitating panic when all the external confirmation and suggestions disappear.
They're paralyzed, not because they are incapable, but because they have never practiced living without that external structure. The failure isn't intellectual, it is one of will. They were never taught how to stay with their own uncertainty.
So the real promise of education is not the implementation of newer technology or the attainment of higher efficiency scores. It's far humbler than that, and far more difficult.
It lies in 3 simple, courageous choices by the adults who lead them. First, we must dare to let students be confused. Second, we must dare to let their initial answers be incomplete and messy.
And third,
We must dare to let an immature, non-optimized thought exist long enough for the student to claim it and commit to it, making it truly their own.
because AI can suggest a way to think, but it cannot bear the fear of thinking differently. It cannot tremble for us when we're facing profound uncertainty. It can't take the existential risk that's required for true conviction.
Using optimization to soothe this internal fear creates a technically stable generation in the short term. But choosing to preserve and endure that fear and teaching students how to endure it is what preserves the essence of humanity. It's what preserves the will to be something more than a predictable, optimized cog.
This has been a necessary and I think a deeply challenging deep dive into the architecture of modern thought. The crisis, as we've explored, is not AI's intelligence, but our systemic adult readiness to deploy it specifically to eliminate the necessary, painful ambiguity that's required for genuine intellectual development. And this readiness is fundamentally driven by the institutional fear of error.
And that leaves us with a final, unsettling question from the source material. It's a question directed right at you, the listener, the learner, the person trying to navigate this incredibly optimized world. When every efficient way of thinking is already suggested, do we still have the courage to live with a thought that has never been optimized but is truly our own?